Why do most horror movies suck? And not just as poorly crafted pieces of cinema, but as in very few are legitimately scary. Well, I know at least one film, and why it is so, that is truly terrifying. So I have a love-hate relationship to horror films. On one hand, I absolutely crave genre films that can bring me to the brink of terror while resolving some deeply buried morbid curiosity, as if our biggest fear, that of death, when allowed to lay dormant too long, can fester and haunt us worse than any fiction. And yet when we can courageously or between shielded eyes look headfirst into the belly of the beast, we are that much more prepared for the eventuality that we will take our last breath at some point and shuffle off this mortal coil, and we hope to do so without blinking. And yet, I hate horror films because most can't even begin to go there, to explore the darkness behind the shadows. Frankly, most horror films are just bad, poorly executed works with pop sensibilities that typically fall flat in the third act, and that never reveal anything deeper, as no truth is uncovered, except for the fact that I now know that the filmmaker likely couldn't face their own fear if that's what they think fear looks like. So I just leave the theater, not scared or more brave, just disappointed. So when a film comes around, as is almost never the case, that doesn't let me down, it's worth singing its praises from the rooftops or from my little corner of YouTube. So that's why if you haven't seen 2008's The Strangers, go watch it now or after this video, because it's a prime example of what true terror on the screen looks and feels like. So what does scare me? Well, what scares you? Well, for me, the thought of losing my thoughts, that's goddamn terrifying. Imagine you are told that you have dementia, or imagine being told that you've had a schizophrenic break. Imagine all of a sudden what you've believed to be true your whole life, your unshakable foundation has been completely shifted. That's terrifying to me. And it was done fairly well in a few films, like The Machinist with Christian Bale, which came pretty close, but again, couldn't nail the ending in my opinion. Yet, you know what else terrifies me? Is actual suffering at the hands of a real person, not a fictional apparition, but to be hunted and tormented by people that can and do exist in our actual world. Sure, I love some paranormal story elements because there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Because we can't even begin to grasp how much we don't actually know about our existence. So a poltergeist or a demon from the dimension in between, if done right, which it almost never is, can work because you can play with our absolute ignorance about life and what haunts the vastness of our unknowns. Yet, for me, what works most easily in a horror is when a story is grounded in reality. For example, when you read some passing article or listen to a podcast about a true crime incident where a whole family, kids, neighbors, and pets are just randomly murdered by simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, that is more horrific than our imagination can typically create. And these occurrences happen all the time in bustling cities or in small towns the world around. And that's exactly the type of crime that inspired Brian Bertino's writing, the writer and director of The Strangers. Actually, it was an amalgamation of something that happened to him and the Manson family murders. However, this is not a novel concept. For example, a film franchise that followed like 5 years later, The Purge, has similar elements. But for me, The Purges, if that's how you pluralize it, are like the Fast and Furious of horror. And it's not necessarily a knock on all the Purge films and Furiouses, as I've only seen maybe 5 or 10 minutes of each franchise before I quickly decided it just wasn't for me. But honestly, to each their own. But I wouldn't be surprised if this film, The Strangers, as compared to a real-life event, didn't directly inspire The Purge. But how The Strangers is different and better seems simple in some ways, but hard to reproduce if you don't know why it worked. A prime example is The Strangers sequel, Prey at Night, which again probably was inspired by the first film, a fiction and not real life. Because invoking terror is all about authenticity, but making a quality film is about plot structure and pacing. Yet first we have the problem of subjectivity. So what I'm finding in doing these film or story analyses is how subjective all of our experiences are when we watch a film and intake a narrative. Everybody has an opinion, and who are any of us to say somebody is wrong for feeling anything? So what moves me or what frightens me may not even get you to flinch, or why a film lands for me is not obviously based on empirical, irrefutable truths per se. And I also want to acknowledge both that I don't scare easily and that what makes a piece of art successful or not have many dependent variables for the viewer. However, I attempt to solve this problem, bridge this divide of a personalized experience with a film, a horror in this case, by using a very specific criteria. And if you watch any of my other film breakdowns, I use a beat sheet, which is an outline like a rubric I use when writing or reviewing a film to know if it follows these 15 cinematic beats, a mix of Blake Snyder's Save the Cat template and the original source of the hero's journey, a tried and true Hollywood formula that can also be tracked throughout the history, which was all derived from Joseph Campbell in his seminal work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, because he's the reason George Lucas wrote Star Wars. But here's the gist of it. Across all of our time, our ancient stories, myths, religion, etc., they all follow the same paths, generally speaking. And the hero of those journeys is the same figure, the same archetype, the same individual with 1,000 different faces. So this beat sheet follows our ancestors' oral tales from eons ago, translated down into modern cinematic story beats. And because most moving pictures are about 115 minutes long, and this film is 116, we can track when each of the 3 acts, the beginning, the middle, and the end, need to take place and what conflict or resolution needs to take place within them. And these beats work well for any genre, including horror. However, this particular film would be better described as a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, or as the filmmaker likes to call this movie.
I didn't coin the phrase, but I've heard it explained by someone on the show and it makes a lot of sense. I think this is more of a terror film as opposed to horror. I think it's an absolutely new approach to the genre.
So I will spare you a complete breakdown of this film, but you can print out the beat sheet from the description below and follow along with this film or any horror to see exactly where the film strays or adheres to the hero's journey, even if in the end, like The Strangers, it is a tragedy. I just want to give you a background on the criteria that I'm using to gauge this film's success, but now what makes a film scary or not may be harder to nail down as it's very subjective as well. But again, I am hard to scare, so I'm using that as a much higher bar or threshold to cross, to sift out the scariest of horrors and what makes them so. So let's just presume, since I've analyzed this film beat per beat, that all the story elements are there. The inciting incident occurs exactly when it should at minute 12. The midpoint of the film carries with it a false victory, as we think our heroes may succeed in escaping with their life. But how this tragedy differs and why this film delivers, unlike most horror films, it has a strong third and final act. So slight spoilers ahead. Of course, our heroes do not make it. Our killers succeed, and our monsters only glimpsed in the moonlight is revealed, sort of. And this is what I most remember about this film when I saw it in the theater some 14 years ago, was how it handles the reveal in the denouement. Our mass murderers don't escape into the safety of the night, back into the unknown from which they came, leaving the crime scene, our victims dead and both darkened by blood and the absence of sun, never to see the light of day again, leaving our fears tucked away in the comfort of that trope. That's not how this movie ends. As our heroes sit tied to chairs, their all is lost moment closes in. Day begets night. Our masked killers reveal themselves, but only to our heroes. The sun floods in, and not only were they not saved by the day, the worst is yet to come. See, this is reality. Yeah, most horror films ebb and flow their tension between scenes occurring in the day versus the night. And it's good to break up that tension, but it's not reality. Real suffering is not dictated by our circadian rhythms. Pain can strike whenever. Madness knows no bounds, and murderers take no holidays. So, The Strangers, like reality, wants us to know that the heart of darkness still resides in the sunlight. And what's more terrifying than being killed by cartoonishly creepy mass psychopaths, as what Hollywood often uses as a gimmick, but what's more horrifying is to see the eyes of fate, unflinching, stealing us without remorse from this world. And that's how you end a film, and that's how you scare me if you're taking notes. Now, I'd love to end here as it seems apropos, but like in life, the real life ending is scarier, and the future of the franchise, yes, because now The Strangers is having a reboot trilogy that is now underway, filming somewhere in Europe, I believe. But I am frightened they will not be able to replicate the first film's gravitas, which I also don't want this to go unsaid, but Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman absolutely crushed these performances, making the B-plot, the relationship woes, part of the tragedy. And starting in media res, beginning a narrative in the middle of an action, sort of, So it's not in the midst of a profoundly difficult fight that we start in, but right after it, at the tail end of it. This is a post-fight scene filled with the niceties you muster up after you've expended an overexertion of animosity, when you've gone from saying things you immediately regret to saying things you don't mean just because you're exhausted. It's a beautiful beginning, adding almost an unnecessary narrative element, but that creates a richness and context to this genre film that is so frequently forgotten in horror films, to make the characters believable, and so we are invested in their well-being. It really lulls you into the drama of these characters, and it's a cruel setup because as they physically begin to reconnect, literally about to have sex and find some peace for the night, right on time at minute 12, we get a knock on the door. But this melodrama in the beginning of the movie is our status quo. It is also what makes this film feel that much more real and grounded, and therefore terrifying when they're stalked and attacked. This is hard to replicate, but not impossible. So I bought the DVD set, which includes the sequel, and it's a must-watch for film and horror connoisseurs, not because it's good, but because of its mediocrity. It's a masterclass in what not to do in a sequel. It is an exemplar to how easy a film like the first, The Strangers, could have gone astray with most directors, even with a good script. While Brian Bertino also co-wrote and produced the sequel, he did not direct it. And really the only similarities with the story in general is the monsters in the house or the barbarians at the gate premise, and with the same exact boogeymen, the masks that now have created a franchise around it, done in almost all horror franchises, from Halloween, Friday the 13th, Saw, and The Purges, to name a few. Which is again what frightens me, as the true horror of the first film was not within the masks, but what lay beneath, the real fear behind the unknown, that exists in darkness and in light, and in our minds, and what can exist within our neighbor's eyes. True terror should not be a gimmick unveiled to sell Halloween costumes, but as a plot device to push the characters and us to the brink, to which we can barely tolerate to look at what actually scares us, our unforgotten end, where all ceases to be, our deepest corporeal fear, when we go from the known into the unknown. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. And that's why The Strangers did what a few horror films have done. It almost scared me. So thank you for your time and attention. I have a bunch more film reviews and story analyses on the way, so consider following along and subscribing to see more. Okay, thanks again, bye.